You can ruin your life without ever leaving your chair, not through one dramatic mistake, not through one disaster, but through a pattern, a quiet one, a thought that enters your mind, stays too long, and slowly starts shaping the way you see everything. Then another thought joins it, then another. And before you realize it, your whole inner world is being run by fear, doubt, shame, anger, comparison, and worst-case scenarios that haven't even happened. That is how toxic thinking works. It does not always arrive like a breakdown. Sometimes it arrives like a normal day. A small insecurity in the morning, a memory you replay too many times, a conversation you keep rewriting in your head, a future you keep imagining in the darkest possible way. And little by little, your mind stops feeling like a place you live in and starts feeling like a place you are trapped in. What makes this worse is that toxic thoughts rarely sound toxic at first. They sound reasonable. They sound protective. They sound intelligent. They sound like caution, honesty, self-awareness, deep thinking. But many of them are doing the exact opposite. They are draining your energy, weakening your confidence, distorting your perception, and teaching you to live in reaction instead of direction. And maybe that is the part no one says clearly enough. A toxic mind does not just make you feel bad, it changes your behavior. It makes you hesitate when you should move. It makes you retreat when you should speak. It makes you question yourself in moments that require strength. It turns small problems into emotional storms. It steals time, clarity, presence, and sometimes entire years of a person's life. So this episode is not about becoming positive all the time. It is not about pretending pain is not real. It is not about forcing your mind to be quiet every second of the day. It is about something more powerful than that. It's about learning how to see a destructive thought before it takes control of you. It's about breaking the loop before it becomes your personality. It's about taking your mind back from the habits that have been poisoning it. Because the truth is, you do not need a perfect mind to build a strong life. But you do need to stop letting every dark thought sit on the throne. You do need to stop treating every fearful idea like a command. And you do need to understand that if you do not take control of what happens inside you, something weaker, louder, and more damaged will keep doing it for you. Tonight, I want to walk with you through that inner battlefield. I want to show you why your thoughts lie, why what you avoid keeps growing, why overthinking feels deep but often keeps you weak, and how people slowly lose themselves by listening too long to the worst voice in the room, the one living in their own head. Because once you see what toxic thinking is really doing to you, you cannot unsee it. And once you learn how to stop feeding it, your life starts to change in ways that feel almost shocking. Not all at once, but enough to make you feel something you may not have felt in a long time. Space. And from that space, everything begins. The first thing you have to understand is that your mind is not a sacred place just because it is yours. It is not automatically honest because it speaks in your voice. And it is not wise just because it sounds familiar. Some of the most destructive lies you have ever believed did not come from another person. They came from inside your own head, repeated so often that they started to feel like common sense. That is what makes toxic thinking dangerous. It doesn't always attack you as an obvious enemy. It often speaks like a trusted narrator. It says, "This is who you are. This is how life is. This is what people think of you. This is what will happen." And if you never stop to question it, you begin living inside a reality that was built by fear, not truth. A lot of people suffer for years because they treat every thought like evidence. If they feel insecure, they assume they must be inadequate. If they feel anxious, they assume something bad must be coming. If they feel ashamed, they assume they must have done something unforgivable. But a thought is not proof. A thought is an event. It appears, it pulls on your emotions, and if you are not careful, it recruits your behavior. That is where the damage happens. Not when the thought first appears, but when you hand it authority without examination. When you let one passing mental sentence decide your mood, your confidence, your relationships, your next move. That is how people slowly become strangers to themselves, not through one huge collapse, but through thousands of small internal surrenders. And the mind can be incredibly convincing when it wants to keep you small. It knows exactly which wound to touch. It knows the old insecurity that still works. It knows how to take one awkward moment and turn it into a story about your whole identity. You make one mistake and it says, "This is why nothing works out for you." Someone pulls away and it says, "This is why nobody stays." You feel behind for one evening and suddenly it tells you your whole life is falling apart. Toxic thoughts do not describe reality. They contaminate it. They take something limited, emotional, temporary, and stretch it into something absolute. That is why one of the most important skills you can build is the ability to pause and ask a very simple question. Is this true, or is this just loud? That question can save you from a lot of inner damage, because many thoughts feel urgent only because they are emotionally charged. They come with heat, with pressure, with a sense that you need to react right now. But urgency is not the same thing as truth. Volume is not wisdom. Repetition is not accuracy. Some thoughts keep coming back not because they are correct, but because your mind has practiced them so many times that they have become automatic. You are not hearing truth. You are hearing conditioning, old fear, old shame, old survival patterns dressed up as insight. Once you begin seeing that, something shifts. You stop standing underneath every thought as if it came from a judge. You start standing beside it like a witness. You begin noticing the pattern. This is the voice that catastrophizes. This is the voice that assumes rejection. This is the voice that turns uncertainty into doom. This is the voice that only knows how to speak in extremes. And the more clearly you can identify those patterns, the less power they have to define you. Because the moment you see the distortion, you are no longer fully inside it. That does not mean the thoughts disappear. It means you stop kneeling every time they speak. And that is where mental freedom starts. Not when your mind becomes perfect, but when you stop believing that every sentence it produces deserves obedience. The lie loses power the moment it is recognized as a lie. And for a lot of people, that recognition is the first real crack in the prison. When you realize your thoughts are not always telling you the truth, the next uncomfortable truth becomes impossible to avoid. Some of what controls you now is not what you faced. It is what you refuse to face. That is where things get more unsettling, because a toxic thought is not always something aggressive that crashes into your mind. Sometimes it is something you pushed down a long time ago and hoped would stay buried. A fear you never named. A grief you never really processed. A humiliation you pretended did not matter. A resentment you kept covering with politeness. People often imagine that what they avoid becomes weaker with time. But avoidance does not erase. It preserves. It freezes the wound in the exact shape it was left in, and then it lets that wound quietly influence everything around it. This is why what you ignore can control you, not because it is mysterious, but because anything unexamined starts operating automatically. A person who never faced their fear of rejection may call themselves independent, while secretly organizing their whole life around not being exposed. A person who never faced their shame may become obsessed with achievement, image, or control without understanding why rest feels so unsafe. A person who never admitted how angry they really are may keep attracting conflict, tension, and emotional exhaustion while telling themselves they just have bad luck with people. The surface story changes, the hidden driver does not. And this is what makes the mind so difficult to live with when you are not honest with yourself. The part of you that feels hurt does not disappear just because the conscious part decides to move on. It waits. It leaks into your tone, your choices, your relationships, your self-talk. It shapes what you tolerate. It shapes what you chase. It shapes what kind of pain feels familiar enough to call home. Then, one day, you look at your patterns and wonder why the same emotional themes keep finding you. But in many cases, it is not life hunting you. It is the unresolved part of you quietly recreating what it already knows. A lot of people do not want to hear this because it feels unfair. It is easier to say my problem is stress, bad timing, difficult people, the wrong environment. And yes, sometimes those things are real. But there are also times when the deeper problem is that you are still being led by something you never turned around and looked at directly. You say you want peace, but you are still protecting the identity built around pain. You say you want freedom, but part of you still clings to the familiar suffering because at least it explains why you have not fully lived. That is the hidden seduction of misery. It hurts, but it also gives you a script. It gives you an excuse. It gives you something to blame. And as long as pain keeps serving a psychological function, the mind will keep returning to it. This is why healing begins to feel threatening at a certain point. Because if you actually let go of the old wound, then something else becomes necessary. Responsibility, choice, exposure, growth, a different way of living. And a lot of people would rather stay trapped in a painful identity than step into a life where they can no longer hide behind it. That sounds harsh, but it explains a lot. It explains why some people keep replaying the same inner story even when they say they are tired of it. The story may be making them miserable, but it is also making them legible to themselves. Without it, they would have to meet a version of themselves they have never learned how to be. So the question is not only what thought is hurting you. The deeper question is what unhealed thing keeps producing that thought. What fear still sits underneath your overreactions? What old conclusion about yourself still colors the present? What part of your life is being quietly organized around something you never had the courage to examine? Because until you ask that, you will keep trying to solve a surface pattern without touching the root. And once you start touching the root, another pattern becomes obvious. A lot of what feels like deep thinking is not depth at all. It is fear, circling in place, trying to look intelligent. That is why overthinking can be so deceptive. It flatters you while it weakens you. It makes you feel engaged, serious, responsible, mentally active. It gives the illusion that you are doing something important just because your mind is busy. But mental activity is not the same thing as movement. A crowded mind is not always a productive one. And a person can spend years mistaking internal noise for depth, while their real life remains untouched, delayed, half-lived. Overthinking often begins as an attempt to protect yourself. You tell yourself you are trying to understand the situation better, trying to avoid mistakes, trying to see every angle. That sounds wise on the surface. But if the thinking never turns into clarity, and clarity never turns into action, then something else is happening. You are not solving. You are circling. You are not preparing. You are postponing. You are staying in the mental version of life because the real version still asks something from you. Risk, exposure, imperfection, movement without certainty, and that is where fear enters the picture. A lot of overthinking is fear that learned how to sound intelligent. It learned the language of caution, reflection, complexity, self-awareness. It learned how to disguise itself so well that you no longer recognize it as fear at all. You just call it the way I am. You call it being thoughtful. You call it needing more time. Meanwhile, the deeper truth is that you are afraid to choose, afraid to be seen, afraid to act without guarantees, afraid to discover that the thing you keep rehearsing in your mind may not go the way you want in the real world. So instead of stepping into life, you keep building more thought around it. More scenarios, more analysis, more internal debate. And the longer that goes on, the more convincing it feels. That is what makes overthinking so exhausting. It rarely gives you the reward it promises. It tells you one more hour of thought will settle the issue. One more angle will finally make you feel ready. One more attempt to mentally control the future will bring peace. But most of the time, it does the opposite. It increases emotional friction. It magnifies uncertainty. It makes simple decisions feel morally loaded and ordinary moments feel psychologically heavy. The mind begins treating everything as if it carries enormous stakes, and soon even small choices start draining you. There is also something emotionally seductive about overthinking. It lets you stay in contact with the problem without confronting the possibility of failure in the real world. It gives you the sensation of involvement without the vulnerability of action. You can think about the conversation instead of having it. You can think about changing your life instead of changing one thing today. You can think about being misunderstood, rejected, inadequate, or too late without ever testing whether those fears are actually true. In that sense, overthinking is not just exhausting. It is protective. It protects you from reality by keeping you busy inside the imagination of reality. But the cost becomes enormous. Because the longer you live this way, the more your confidence starts depending on certainty you will never get. You become less tolerant of ambiguity, less able to move without complete emotional permission, less willing to begin before your mind has approved every detail. And life does not reward that. Life moves with or without your inner committee. Opportunities do not always wait for the perfect internal atmosphere. Relationships do not unfold according to your mental rehearsal. Growth does not arrive when your thoughts finally become tidy. It arrives when you stop demanding total clarity before movement. This is why one of the hardest truths to accept is that you cannot think your way into courage. At some point, thinking becomes the obstacle. At some point, the thing that feels like depth is just hesitation, with a more flattering name. And once you see that, overthinking loses some of its glamour. It stops looking profound and starts looking expensive. Expensive in time, in peace, in momentum, in trust in yourself. And when you are finally tired of that cost, another question starts to matter more than all the others. If these thoughts keep talking, and they keep circling, and they keep trying to define you, then who exactly is the one listening? Who are you beneath the voice that never stops speaking? That question matters more than it seems, because a lot of suffering comes from a confusion that feels natural, but is deeply damaging. You hear a thought in your head, and without realizing it, you merge with it. The voice says you are failing, and for a moment you do not notice that a voice said it. You just feel failure. The voice says you are behind, unlovable, weak, foolish, too late, too broken to change, and instead of recognizing that a mental event is happening, you absorb it as identity. That is how people become possessed by their own inner language. Not in some dramatic way, in a very ordinary way, quietly, repeatedly, until the line between who they are and what they keep hearing becomes almost impossible to see. But the voice in your head is not you. It is a stream of commentary, sometimes useful, sometimes distorted, sometimes frightened, sometimes cruel, sometimes full of old conditioning that has nothing to do with the present moment. It reacts, it predicts, it judges, it remembers selectively, it dramatizes uncertainty and turns emotion into narrative, but none of that makes it your essence. None of that makes it the deepest truth about who you are. The fact that a thought appears inside your consciousness does not mean it has earned the right to define your consciousness. This is a shift that changes everything when it becomes real, because once you stop saying "this is me" and start saying "this is a voice I am hearing," space opens up. A voice can be observed, a voice can be questioned, a voice can be disobeyed, but an identity feels absolute. If you believe the thought is you, then every dark sentence feels final. Every surge of fear feels like revelation. Every old insecurity feels permanent. There is no room to move because you're trapped inside the thing that is speaking. The moment you realize that the inner voice is only one layer of the mind, not the totality of the self, you begin recovering the ability to stand apart from it. And that distance is not coldness, it is freedom. It does not mean you become numb or detached from your humanity. It means you stop being dragged by every internal reaction. You stop treating each mental whisper as sacred instruction. You begin to notice the patterns in the voice itself, the way it grows harsher when you are tired, the way it becomes dramatic when you feel uncertain, the way it reaches for old shame when something new asks courage from you, the way it always sounds most convincing when you are emotionally exposed. Once you see that pattern clearly, the voice becomes less magical, less authoritative, less like a prophet, more like a frightened mechanism repeating what it knows. A lot of people spend their whole lives obeying an inner narrator they never chose. It may sound like a parent, an old humiliation, a social wound, a season of depression, a standard of perfection they internalized years ago. It may tell them they are only safe when they are pleasing everyone, or only worthy when they are achieving non-stop, or only lovable when they never fully reveal themselves. And because the voice has been there so long, they mistake familiarity for truth. But familiarity only means repetition. It does not mean wisdom. The deeper self is quieter than that. Not silent, but quieter. It doesn't usually scream, accuse, catastrophize, or reduce your whole life to one bad hour. It is the part of you that can witness your fear without becoming it. The part that can feel pain without turning pain into destiny. The part that knows a thought can be loud and still be wrong. And strengthening that part changes the whole internal balance of power. Because now the voice can speak, but it no longer rules. It can make its case, but it no longer sits on the throne. That is the beginning of self-leadership. Not getting rid of the voice, but refusing to hand it absolute authority. Refusing to become whatever it says in your worst moments. Refusing to confuse mental noise with identity. And once you learn that, the next responsibility becomes unavoidable. If you are not the voice, then you have to stop feeding it every time it starts its performance. That is where responsibility becomes practical. It is one thing to realize you are not the voice in your head. It is another thing to notice how often you still keep it alive. A toxic thought rarely survives on its own for very long. It needs reinforcement. It needs your attention, your repetition, your emotional investment, your willingness to keep reopening the same mental door. And most of the time, that is exactly what happens. The thought appears, and instead of letting it pass, you sit with it, argue with it, decorate it, expand it, connect it to 5 older memories, imagine 3 future disasters, and before long, the original thought has become a full internal environment. That is how a brief flash turns into a loop. This is why negative thinking can feel so powerful, not because every thought is strong by nature, but because you keep returning to it as if there must be something important there. The mind says, "Look at this again." You obey. The mind says, "What if this means something terrible?" You obey again. The mind offers another interpretation, another replay, another angle, and you keep participating. Then later, you tell yourself the thought would not leave you alone. But in many cases, what really happened is that you would not stop feeding it. You kept bringing it back to the table and serving it more meaning, more fear, more time. And this is one of the hardest habits to break because it often feels responsible while you are doing it. Replaying a mistake can feel like self-correction. Revisiting rejection can feel like self-protection. Anticipating every possible failure can feel like preparation. But if the process leaves you weaker, more hesitant, more emotionally flooded, and less able to live your actual life, then it is not helping you. It is consuming you. Some thoughts do not need a debate. They need starvation. They need to be met with less interest, less ceremony, less emotional hospitality. That does not mean suppressing everything or pretending you do not feel what you feel. Real pain still deserves honesty. Real fear may still need to be understood. But there is a difference between acknowledging a thought and building a home for it. There is a difference between noticing the mind spiral and helping it spiral harder. A lot of inner suffering grows not because the thought was so profound, but because the person kept kneeling in front of it, kept checking whether it was still there, kept asking what else it might mean, kept turning one spark into a private fire. So part of taking control of your mind is learning how to stop cooperating with what poisons it. You do not answer every thought. You do not follow every invitation. You do not sit down with every fear that knocks. Some thoughts need to be seen clearly and then left alone, not because they are harmless, but because your continued engagement is what makes them dangerous. The loop gains strength from your participation. Break the participation, and the loop starts losing oxygen. This takes discipline because the mind often panics when you stop feeding it. It will tell you this thought is too important to ignore. It will insist that peace is irresponsible, that letting go means you're missing something, that if you do not keep obsessing, you will be blindsided. But this is where self-leadership begins to mature. You stop measuring importance by emotional intensity. You stop assuming that whatever makes you feel the most tension deserves the most attention. You begin choosing what you will nourish, and that choice changes the whole inner landscape. Because the moment you stop feeding every destructive loop, something else becomes visible. You begin to notice how much of your mental life was being shaped by where your attention kept going, not just by your thoughts, but by what you kept strengthening with your focus. That is why attention is never a small thing. It is one of the most decisive forces in your inner life. Whatever keeps receiving your focus starts taking up psychological territory. Whatever you return to again and again begins shaping your emotional climate, your expectations, even your sense of self. This is why a person can spend hours feeding comparison, resentment, fear, or imaginary conflict, and then wonder why peace feels so far away. The mind follows what it is trained to follow, and every day, with almost no ceremony at all, you are training it. A lot of people think their problem is that they have too many negative thoughts, but often the deeper problem is that their attention has become weak, porous, easily hijacked. Everything gets in. Every notification, every memory, every unfinished fear, every subtle insult, every piece of content designed to provoke insecurity or urgency. And when attention is that unguarded, the mind stops feeling like a place of direction and starts feeling like a public space where anything can walk in and take over. You may think you are just tired, distracted, a little overwhelmed, but sometimes what is really happening is that your attention has been stolen so many times that you no longer remember what it feels like to inhabit your own mind with intention. That is where toxic thinking becomes easier to understand. A destructive thought is not only a sentence in the mind, it is also a claim on attention. It wants your eyes, your mental energy, your emotional bandwidth. It wants to become the center of gravity for the next 10 minutes, the next hour, sometimes the whole day. And if you are not careful, it succeeds not because it is true, but because it is dramatic, because it is emotionally loud, because the mind is often more seduced by what disturbs it than by what steadies it. This is why guarding your attention matters so much. Not in some abstract productivity sense, but in a deeply human sense. Your attention is your life in motion. Where it goes, you go. The hard part is that reclaiming attention does not feel glamorous. It is rarely dramatic. It is built in small refusals. Refusing to revisit the same humiliation one more time. Refusing to check something again that already poisoned your mood 3 times today. Refusing to let one person's opinion dominate your internal world. Refusing to keep scanning for proof that you are failing, rejected, behind, or unsafe. It is built every time you notice the pull and choose not to follow it. Every time you redirect without turning the whole moment into a moral crisis. Every time you say, "No, not there. I know what happens when I go there." And this is where attention starts becoming a form of power. Not because you suddenly become calm all the time, but because you stop being infinitely available to whatever hurts you. You stop letting the most anxious part of your mind decide what deserves your focus. You become more selective, more deliberate, more protective of your inner space, and that changes things faster than people expect. Because when attention is no longer leaking everywhere, clarity starts returning. Energy starts returning. Presence starts returning. You begin to feel less scattered, less hunted by your own mind, less trapped in loops that once felt automatic. But there is another layer to this that people often miss. Sometimes the reason your attention is so unstable is not only psychological. Sometimes your body is already in distress, and your mind is simply speaking the language of that distress. What feels like a broken mind is sometimes a body that has been pushed too far, too long. This is where a lot of people misunderstand their own suffering. They keep trying to solve a biological problem with philosophy alone. They analyze the thought, question the story, reflect on the pattern, and sometimes that helps. But there are also moments when the mind is not producing darkness out of nowhere. It is translating exhaustion, overstimulation, poor sleep, chronic stress, too much caffeine, too little movement, too much screen light, too much tension held in the nervous system. And if you ignore that layer, you can end up making your mental life feel far more mysterious than it actually is. A body under constant strain will create a mind that feels harder to live in. When your nervous system is already activated, everything becomes easier to misread. Neutral moments feel threatening. Small frustrations feel bigger than they are. Uncertainty starts sounding like danger. You become less patient with yourself, less resilient with discomfort, less able to create any inner distance from the next wave of thought. Then, the mind starts producing explanations for that state. It says, maybe something is deeply wrong with me. Maybe my life is collapsing. Maybe I am losing control. But sometimes, what is really happening is much less dramatic and much more physical. Your system is overloaded, and your thoughts are being shaped inside that overload. That does not mean the mental pain is fake. It means it is embodied. It means the mind is not floating above the body like some separate machine. The two are in constant conversation. If the body is neglected long enough, the mind starts speaking with that neglect in its voice. This is why people who are underslept, sedentary, overstimulated, inflamed, tense, or chronically dysregulated often become more vulnerable to spirals they later interpret as purely psychological. Their thoughts become darker, more absolute, more reactive, not because their soul changed overnight, but because their physical state changed the conditions under which thought is happening. And that can actually be a relief to understand. Because once you see the physical layer, you stop treating every bad mental state like a grand revelation. You begin asking simpler, more honest questions. How long have I been running on fumes? How much stress has my body been carrying without recovery? When was the last time I slept deeply, moved enough, breathed fully, spent real time away from stimulation, let my system come down? These questions sound almost too practical to matter, but they matter more than many people want to admit. A body that feels trapped will often create a mind that speaks in trapped language. This is one reason toxic thoughts become so convincing late at night, after burnout, during chronic stress, or in periods when the body has been treated like an afterthought. The mind loses perspective when the system is depleted. It becomes narrower, harsher, more dramatic. It starts taking temporary physiological distress and turning it into total conclusions about your identity and your future. That is why it is dangerous to build a philosophy of yourself from your most exhausted state. You are not seeing clearly there. You are interpreting life through a body that is already waving distress signals. So part of taking control of your mind means learning to respect the physical conditions that shape it. Not in a shallow self-care way, in a serious way, in the same way you would respect the conditions that affect judgment, reaction time, or recovery in any other domain of life. Because if your body is carrying too much tension, your mind will often carry too much poison. If your system never feels safe enough to settle, your thoughts will keep sounding like emergency broadcasts. And once you understand that, you stop asking your mind to become peaceful while your body is still living like it is under attack. But even that insight only takes you so far, because sooner or later there comes a moment when the thought is still there, the fear is still there, the uncertainty is still there, and you still have to move. That is where everything changes. Because some things in the mind do not break through more thinking. They break through action. This is the point where a lot of people wait too long. They wait for the right mood, the right certainty, the right level of confidence, the right inner silence. They keep telling themselves that once they feel clearer, calmer, more sure of themselves, then they will act. Then they will make the call, start the habit, leave the situation, say what needs to be said, begin the thing they have been circling for months or years. But that moment rarely comes the way they imagine it. Not because they are broken, but because clarity is often a result of action, not a prerequisite for it. The mind loves to delay movement by making readiness feel sacred. It says, "Not yet." Think a little more. Wait until you feel stronger. Wait until the fear goes down. Wait until you can do it without discomfort. But many of the most important things in life do not happen after fear disappears. They happen while fear is still present. They happen while the voice is still doubting, while the body still feels resistance, while uncertainty still hangs in the air. And the person who learns this gains an advantage that changes everything. They stop negotiating with hesitation. They stop asking their emotions for permission to live. Because action does something thinking cannot. It interrupts the spell. It breaks the closed circuit. A thought loop feeds on stillness, on delay, on internal repetition. It becomes stronger when all your energy stays trapped inside the same mental room. But the moment you move, something shifts. Reality enters, feedback enters, friction enters. The fantasy of what might happen starts colliding with what is actually happening. And that matters, because the mind is often much more dramatic in anticipation than life is in practice. Think about how many things have felt enormous in your head and strangely manageable once you finally did them. The conversation you avoided, the task you built into a mountain, the decision you kept trying to perfect internally. The mind kept inflating it, because inflation is what an anxious mind does when it has too much time and no counterforce. Action becomes that counterforce. Not because it guarantees success, but because it replaces endless speculation with contact. Contact with reality, contact with the moment, contact with the fact that you are more capable in motion than you are in paralysis. And this is where a lot of inner healing begins to feel less philosophical and more practical. You do not always need one more insight. Sometimes you need one honest step, one email, one walk, one boundary, 1 hour of work, one difficult sentence spoken out loud, one decision made without waiting for total emotional agreement. These things may look small from the outside, but inside the mind, they are revolutionary. Because every time you act while fear is still talking, you teach yourself something powerful. The voice is not in charge. The feeling is not the ruler. Movement is still possible. That lesson builds real confidence, the kind people cannot fake for long. Not the confidence that comes from hyping yourself up, but the confidence that comes from evidence. I was afraid, and I still moved. I was unsure, and I still acted. I did not wait to become another person first. I moved as the person I was, and something in me became stronger because of it. That is how people slowly take their lives back from toxic thought patterns. Not by winning every internal argument, but by refusing to let the argument decide everything. This matters because the mind will never run out of reasons to delay. It will always be able to generate another objection, another fear, another possibility, another emotional weather report telling you that today is not the day. If you keep obeying that rhythm, your life becomes shaped by hesitation in ways that are almost invisible until too much time has passed. But when you begin acting before your mind feels ready, you break that pattern at its root. You stop training yourself to wait for perfect conditions. You stop building a life around emotional permission. You become someone who can carry uncertainty and still move forward. And once you learn that, another illusion begins to collapse. The illusion that strength means having a perfectly calm mind. It does not. Some of the strongest people you will ever meet are not the ones with silence inside them. They are the ones who learned how to keep walking even when the noise did not fully leave. That matters because a lot of people chase the wrong image of mental strength. They imagine that a strong person must feel centered all the time. clear all the time, unaffected all the time. They imagine that peace means no fear, no noise, no intrusive thoughts, no inner resistance. And when their own mind does not look like that, they assume they are failing. They assume they are not healing fast enough, not disciplined enough, not evolved enough to live differently. But that idea itself becomes another trap, because now you are not only struggling with the mind you have, you are also punishing yourself for not having a different one. The truth is, strength is not the absence of internal noise. Strength is what you do while the noise is there. It is the ability to keep your direction even when your mind keeps offering you detours. It is the ability to feel fear without turning fear into prophecy. It is the ability to hear the old thought, recognize it, and still refuse to build your day around it. That is a much more honest version of power, less theatrical, more useful, and for most people, far more real. Because the mind does not always become quiet just because you are trying hard. Some seasons of life are louder than others. Grief can make the mind loud. Burnout can make it loud. Change can make it loud. Healing can make it loud too, because old material often speaks more clearly right before it starts losing power. So if your standard for strength is total silence, you will keep thinking you are behind whenever the mind becomes difficult again. But if your standard becomes steadier than that, something shifts. You begin measuring strength by your relationship to the noise, not by the total disappearance of it. This is where people start becoming much harder to break, not because they never feel shaken, but because they stop panicking every time they do. The thought comes, and they do not crown it. The fear rises, and they do not turn it into destiny. The mind gets noisy, and they do not conclude that all progress is gone. They understand something deeper now. A loud mind is not always a dangerous mind. Sometimes it is just a mind under pressure. Sometimes it is a mind passing through weather, and weather is real, but it is not the whole sky. That distinction can save you from a lot of unnecessary suffering, because when you stop demanding perfect inner conditions, you stop making every difficult moment mean something catastrophic. You stop saying, "I am back at the beginning." You stop saying, "Nothing has changed." You stop saying, "If I were truly strong, I would not still be thinking this." Instead, you begin saying something quieter and more mature. The noise is here, but I am still here too. The thought is speaking, but I do not have to obey. My mind is unsettled, but my direction can remain intact. And that kind of self-leadership changes the emotional atmosphere of a life. It creates steadiness where there used to be panic. It creates patience where there used to be self-attack. It creates resilience, not by promising you that the mind will never get dark again, but by teaching you that darkness does not automatically get control. This is how a person stops being ruled by inner chaos, not by winning a fantasy of permanent peace, but by becoming someone who can function, choose, and remain rooted even when peace is incomplete. That may sound like a smaller victory than total calm, but it is actually much bigger, because it is real, it is repeatable, it is the kind of strength that survives actual life. And once you begin living from that place, one final truth becomes impossible to ignore. You do not have unlimited time to keep giving your life away to thoughts that keep shrinking it. That is the part people avoid until life forces it on them. Time feels abstract when you are lost in thought. It feels endless when your life is happening mostly in your head. You tell yourself there will be time later to start over, later to change, later to speak honestly, later to stop wasting energy on the same patterns. But later is one of the favorite hiding places of a toxic mind. It lets you postpone the cost. It lets you keep living as if your days are renewable, as if the mornings you lose to dread, the nights you lose to mental noise, the years you lose to hesitation and self-poisoning will somehow return untouched. They do not. And that truth is not meant to make you afraid in a cheap way. It is meant to bring you back to scale. So many toxic thoughts survive because they are treated like they are enormous. They dominate your attention. They fill your inner world until they start feeling more important than the life around them. But set them next to mortality, and something changes. The argument shrinks. The obsession shrinks. The petty self-torment shrinks. Not because your pain was fake, but because perspective finally enters the room. You are running out of time, not in a dramatic sentence for effect, but in the most ordinary and serious sense. Your life is being spent whether you are present for it or not. Every day your mind is allowed to drag you through the same poison. Something is being used up. Energy, courage, openness, time with people you love, time to become who you could still become, time to build a life that feels like yours. And one of the saddest ways a person can disappear is not through one catastrophe, but through chronic internal erosion, through years of letting the worst voice inside them keep deciding what is possible. At some point, that has to become unacceptable. Not because you suddenly become fearless, not because your mind finally behaves, but because you begin to understand the price of letting it keep ruling you. You begin to see that these thoughts are not just uncomfortable. They are expensive. They cost you presence. They cost you movement. They cost you self-respect. They cost you chances you cannot recreate on demand. And once you really feel that, something in you starts becoming less available to nonsense, less available to spirals that lead nowhere, less willing to hand over an entire day to a thought that has already stolen too many. This is where real sobriety enters the inner life. You stop asking only, "Is this thought painful?" and start asking, "What is this thought costing me?" You stop treating your inner chaos like an endless emotional weather report and start seeing it in terms of consequence. If I keep believing this, how will I live? If I keep rehearsing this fear, what kind of person will it shape? If I keep waiting for perfect certainty, how much of my life will pass unopened? Those questions are uncomfortable, but they are clean. They cut through the fog. And once they cut through it, you start seeing your mind differently, not as a place to endlessly study, but as a place to lead, not as a court where every fearful voice gets equal time, but as a territory that needs order. You begin understanding that peace is not something that arrives after every toxic thought is defeated. Peace begins the moment you stop treating those thoughts like the center of your existence. The moment you refuse to build your identity around their repetition. The moment you remember that life is moving, whether your mind is ready or not. So this is where the whole episode leads. Not to the fantasy of a perfect mind, not to becoming some untouchable person who never struggles again. It leads to a more honest kind of strength. The strength to question the thought instead of worshipping it. The strength to face what you buried instead of being ruled by it. The strength to move while fear is still talking. The strength to protect your attention, respect your body, and stop confusing internal noise with truth. The strength to understand that a powerful life is not built by people who never think dark thoughts. It is built by people who stop letting those thoughts run the structure of the day. Because in the end, that is what control really means. Not controlling every thought, not controlling every emotion, not controlling life itself. It means refusing to live as a servant to whatever rises inside you. It means remembering that you can hear the voice without becoming it. You can feel the fear without kneeling to it. You can have a loud mind and still live a clear life. And once that becomes real for you, toxic thoughts start losing the thing they depended on most: your obedience.